Hello, welcome to the new podcast series, King of the Middle, with Michael Joel Green and Chris Moore. Here's Michael Green.
Welcome everybody to King of the Middle podcast. I am Michael, this is Chris, and we are artist, creative types who also are trying to follow and glorify God with our work and trying to figure out what that means. How do you do that? And what are the challenges with that? Tonight we're going to be talking, we may hit on some sort of hot button issues. We're going to be talking about how cultural moments and societal issues impact our work, how we write, how we create, how these things impact the characters we create, or the characters we are if we don't create. So with that said, Chris, I think this was your idea. What was your thought process, or what were you thinking when you brought up the idea of brought up this issue?
Yeah, so we're doing this episode in the middle of a pandemic, 7 months in, and not only are we dealing with a pandemic, but we're dealing with this new age of all kinds of social unrest and calls for social justice, combined with progressivism, like churches that are generally leaning towards a progressive stance on these issues, which means churches that are looking more towards how do we find ourselves at peace and resolve ourselves with the world around us. Problem is, if you're not careful and you're not focused on the Lord and on the Bible, you're going to take shortcuts to get to that place of calm and supposed calm and peace. But what you're actually doing is now you're turning your back on the Bible. And for us, what struck me for us as artist writers is how are we dealing with these issues, and how are we dealing with them in a legitimate way with both compassion but also biblical truth. And you and I, Michael, are in the process of writing tandem books that we started together, short story collections that will be coming out soon. And these books, we're dealing with a lot of social issues. You've got all kinds of stuff in your collection that you can talk more about, and I do want to ask you tonight more about your stories. And in mine, I can say, I think I've said a little bit here and there throughout this podcast series, I'm dealing with a memeing and a father and a daughter who are kind of used to shaming each other on Facebook. It's not that they're used to shaming, but they joke with each other. But the father crosses the line and it causes the daughter to double up. And she posts something about the father making fun of the Me Too movement, that her dad takes a crap on the Me Too movement, and it causes a storm of trouble. And I'm releasing for Halloween a short story called Blackface, set in 91 New Jersey, about a white kid who convinces his black buddies to get dressed up as NWA, which is Ice Cube, Dr. Dre, and go out as NWA in Halloween in New Jersey 1991 because they want to be social justice warriors. The kid is convinced from the MTV era, which you and I were growing up in high school and college, he's convinced right at the point where Rodney King happened, there was no verdict yet, but Rodney King had been beaten by the LAPD. And this is right at that time, and the kid's like, let's go out for social justice. I'm going to put blackface on because I'm white, but I gotta be one of the guys, and I can't go out as a white guy. And he convinces his friends. And then there are other stories that are in this collection too that I'm working on. And the thing that I constantly ask myself is, how can I deal with these modern issues, social justice, and concern for other people who have views that are much different from mine? But how do I do it so that I'm not serving a Marxist movement, which is my blackface story. I'm very concerned because I don't want it to serve the Marxist movement, which says everything in our government is wrong, everything in our world is wrong, our whole way of life is wrong, and it all needs to be overthrown. And that social justice, critical race theory is tearing this country apart. So as a Christian, I want to write a story to talk about these things, but I do not want to go that route. I don't want to serve those folks and say, I'm on your side right on. It's like, No, actually, I'm trying to do this from a biblical standpoint to say, what would Jesus actually say about this, rather than what does the world say on one side, the world without God, and on the other side, what does a hard right, what does a church that's, or conservatives that might be hard right, what would they say? Because quite frankly, that's not what Jesus would say or do either. So I think why I wanted to talk about this and have a discussion tonight is to hear from you, Michael, and maybe share some from me. What is it how are we dealing with this stuff? How are we dealing right now with writers telling stories that reflect the real world and the brokenness without shortcut preaching, and on the other side, drinking the Kool-Aid of all these social progressive all these social progressive solutions to things which are not biblical. So, and by doing that, if we can find a way to actually ask ourselves, what do we think Jesus would say about this? We're breaking out of the middle. We're rising up from mediocrity because we're actually trying to tell a story that's not shortcutting with lazy storytelling, because you're just trying to preach to the choir. Hollywood's doing it on the left right now, all over the place, and Christians are countering with all kinds of stuff on the right. So, yeah. So, what are your thoughts? Like, we talk a lot about this outside of this podcast, obviously, and with other friends, because we're grappling with these difficult times. So, I don't know. What are your thoughts before we dig into some practical questions about specific work that we're doing?
Oh man. Can you make a more loaded question, brother? I think right out of the gate, man. I used to have a preacher in Seattle, and he was not talking about these issues, but he was talking about other issues. But he would say, if you're getting shot, if you're in the middle of an issue and you're getting shot at by both sides, then you're probably where God wants you. And I believe that. So, if I'm getting shot at right now by both sides, then it sucks. It's tension filled, but I'm probably right where I need to be. You mentioned your story, Blackface. And the reason that I bring this up after you mention it is because, our culture right now is reactionary. We're not looking any deeper than the instant media response. So if you were to see a teenager wearing, or even a photo, let's say your story was real. These kids were in the late 80s, early 90s, I can't remember.
91. Yeah.
91.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say these kids are now, do the math, whatever, 40-something years old, yeah. And a photo surfaces of one of those kids. And he is in Halloween makeup of Eazy-E, an NWA member. The instant response is going to be outrage, cancel, without trying to discern. I'm going to come back to the word discernment in a minute. Without trying to discern what was going through that kid's mind in 1991. Motives were actually good, but we don't have the discernment because, we're not. I don't know why we don't have it. God says the Holy Spirit gives discernment, so there's something to that. But right now we don't go there because it's instant outrage. This is something we all know, so I'm not saying anything unique. I realize that. What I will say is that if we are to make stories that resonate with people and convict people with whom we disagree. There's got to be some empathy going on. I remember one of my stories is on cancel culture. And I will say straight up, I loathe cancel culture. I think it's evil. I think it's from the devil. Said it there. In my story, I can't say that though, because I'm trying to portray a character who, in his mind, is righteous and is virtuous. But after you read that story the first time, you said you had no empathy for that character at all. And I had to deal with that. On one hand, I didn't really want to make him too likable a character. The character is a fresh out of college, very active, social activist driven, but also very self-righteous, and goes to a protest for a speaker, and portrays himself in a very negative light. But you still have to have empathy for that kid. Why does he disagree with his parents and their politics? Why does he want to look out for his younger brother? We can talk about that. We can talk about this for a long time, but empathy. And I have my political leanings. I have my theological leanings. I'm an opinionated person. But I need better empathy. You ask what this time is like right now. This time is terrible. This has been horrible. You nailed. I completely agree with you. Critical race theory is ripping apart our country. It is destroying the church, and it has invaded the church, and it'll continue to do so until we speak out against it, and we bring focus back onto the true gospel, not the false gospel. And progressivism within the church is a false gospel. But how do you have compassion for those you disagree with? And so I think one of the most enlightening things I've heard in the last couple of years was on the issue of tolerance. And tolerance in its classic definition of tolerance was you were respectful of people, egalitarian towards people, but you were discerning over ideas. You held ideas up for critique, and you were elitist as far as ideas. Some ideas are terrible, but we have rewritten the definition of tolerance to mean all ideas are equal. There is no objective truth, but we can be elitist towards people. We don't have to be egalitarian towards people, only ideas. So what you get is you say you're tolerant until someone actually disagrees with you. And then you go after their character. You call them every name in the book. Tolerant as long as people agree with you. And then your intolerance shows. That to me is one of the most concerning things that I see going on in our culture right now. So what would it mean to be egalitarian? When I mean egalitarian, kind, respectful, accepting of everyone, but still holding ideas up for criticism. That's being lost, and that scares me about as much as anything.
Yeah, and as you said, that differentiating between the person and a view, we've lost that. We've lost the sense of the person versus the view, and now the view is the person. If you have a view that someone disagrees with, then you need to be gone, because you as a person, your value is now, the material value that we hold in the world, the worldly way now is it's about ideas is the currency. Your ideas and the causes that you believe in are your currency, much more so than it's not about obviously necessarily what influence you have with money. It's about influence with ideas. And yeah, we're not up. The big thing that you said, the difference between why wouldn't there be an issue, like how have things changed if you go back and look at something somebody did 40 years ago and you go, oh my gosh, they had blackface on. They're canceled. The SNL recently, the new season of SNL, this guy, Bill Burr, I think his name, was the host. I don't really know who he is, but he's funny. And he was talking about John Wayne because there's a big thing to remove John Wayne Airport, the name from the airport in California, because John Wayne made some statements about Native Americans and some other things in the 70s, early 70s. And it's like, yeah, he wasn't born in these times. He didn't have a chance to get educated as much on some of this more sensitivity because he didn't live in an era where anybody did. But most people don't have recordings of themselves from 40, 50 years ago floating around because they're not stars. And technology didn't exist like it did today. So you don't have tape recordings and video and film of yourself saying crazy things when you were 25. But it's like even the dead are not safe right now because it's not about holding up ideas and say, that idea that he had was wrong, but he did all these good things in his life and he's a product of the time and he may have come around. He might have come around, but nobody gives that sense of, nobody gives that credit anymore. It's whatever you've done, that's it. And it's a never ending series of contrition that you can never give enough to ask for forgiveness.
There's no grace, there's no forgiveness.
Yes.
And there's a lot of bitterness and hostility, but no grace and no forgiveness. So I got my wife hooked on, I was always a fan of the show 24, the old TV show with Kiefer Sutherland.
Oh, yeah.
And at the beginning of the summer, I showed it to my wife, and we literally just plowed through 9 seasons, including starting the 10th with the replacement for Kiefer Sutherland. And I was shocked, but she likes it as much as I do. And she made the comment, she goes, I think I know why you like this show. She goes, because everyone is the bad guy. Everyone is bad. And has those kind of bad and good. And she's dead on, because that is, to me, that's my worldview. We were made in the image of God, but yet when Adam and Eve sinned, we were born into sin. And so we are made in the image of God and capable of great good, but also we are marred by a sinful nature, and so we are also very bad. And I love that show because that's a biblical worldview, even though they didn't know it. I mean, I'll throw a verse out here, Romans 3:10. There is no one good, no, not one. I wrote one of the stories of mine is kind of a short novel, but it's kind of dealing with the question of, how much of our rights are we willing to give up to a government for security and comfort. But there's also this idea of, those making the rules think that they have a moral high ground. And to be honest, it's sort of, I heard this quote by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that I'm paraphrasing, but it's basically she got called out on a lie or a mistruth and said, I'd rather be morally right than factually accurate. And I couldn't help but laugh because thou shalt not lie is a 10th commandment. By lying, you are not moral. So it's like the lack of discernment there is pretty shocking.
Yeah.
At least it was. But here's a question, and I think we can tie this to our heart because let's take racism. Racism is a horrible sin. It is an evil. Question: is racism the worst sin there is? Now, if you can answer that by sort of taking a cultural worldview that says, well, it's sort of up to my feelings, what's worse. Or if you look at it from God's moral law. Well, I don't see in the Bible where racism is worse than, let's say, adultery.
Mm-hmm.
God despises adultery. So,
and there's something it despises more than either of them, which is adultery against him. In other words, false gods is the worst thing, far worse than any of these things.
Yeah, amen.
Yeah.
Bad pride. And so what you're seeing in culture right now, we think, at least the culture thinks it is more moral than those that lived before us, and that there is this moral high ground. But when you really dig down deep, is that correct? Yes, those that were guilty of racism in the past, there's no excusing that. But look at the sins that we are guilty of right now. And if you take a biblical approach that sin is sin and God hates all sin, you lose your moral high ground right there. So you can tear down my statue for something I've done, but get ready to have yours torn down for your adultery, your lying, your theft, because God looks at it all as sin, and the consequences of sin is death. So, these things, you and I we're being very, I guess, I feel like I'm just laying my cards on the table. When we're writing stories or we're creating, there's got to be a lot more, though, subtleness. There's got to be a lot more empathy. So I have to look at the person that is doing the canceling of me, or is reacting to me right now with cursing. And what does that person want? What is that person hoping for with his or her life? That's a challenge for me, because when I feel my values or beliefs being threatened, I tend to lash out, and I need to be in my own personal life, like I try to be in writing, more compassionate, more grace. Look at this, the church. We are to give grace and forgiveness. A culture is merciless. It's forgiveness-less, and it's graceless. So we can look at it now and say, I forgive you. I'm giving you grace. I love you, person who is attacking me or my values or my beliefs. And that's how the church can be a light into this present darkness. And I think we would all agree there's a lot of darkness right now.
Mm-hmm. And because we are king of the middle. That's what this podcast is about. So we're talking about how do we take all this stuff and this pain and the issues of the day and all this distorted, short-circuited thinking, like you had said, where you have to have empathy for the darkest characters that you're creating. We spoke a few episodes back about, we did this series called The Strange Disappearance of Henry Allison, and we started out with a kid who was potentially on the verge of getting adopted as a foster kid, but he had a lot of baggage and had grown up in hell. And he was very unlikable. And before we got a chance to really even get the show kicked off and get it rolling, because we were doing it as an audio drama, a lot of people told us, yeah, we're interested. It's an interesting story, but a lot of people fizzled out. And it was because they didn't like our kid, because he was too hard-edged, and all of his darkness was apparent and out there and open, but the compassion for him, we didn't have it in that the beginnings of what we did. And I think that's a great lesson for us to remember as we're working now, when we're talking about all these issues. You're dealing with a cancel culture guy, and I've got some characters who are in some crazy situations and more stuff I'm working on. And it's, how do I tell these stories in a way to make even the characters I don't like compassionate? Like, look at them how God might look at them. Not that I'm equating myself with that omnipresent view, obviously, little old nobody me, but how would I look at these characters that I'm trying to actually start a dialogue? I want the world, believers and non-believers, to dialogue about these stories. So what do? Well, I really have to work hard to say, somebody I detest, I know that if I detest them, I already know I have an issue as an artist, and that means I've got to be on guard. I have to be on guard for how I'm representing the issues and the character or characters who are representing these social ills. And that's what's tough. But that's what gets us out of middling from mediocrity, doing that. And I think you had just mentioned on this story that you're working on, it's called Umbrella Holders? Is it still called that? That's the title that you're working on. You've been working on the kid in that story, the college kid, to make it so that we understand some about where this anger comes from. Where does this anger come from that he's totally fist pumping, very much in the Marxist movement right now, cancel culture. But that kid and his family and stuff that's going on is like, oh, there's a reason I can understand as a believer, even though I don't like this movement, why would this kid be doing this? And I've got a story I'm working on that's a new story I'm hoping to publish on my website in the near future called Barrel of a Gun. It's about a guy who's fed up, who's far right, and he's fed up. He runs a business, and he's on the edge of something like Chaz and the equivalent in Seattle, and he's decided, since law enforcement doesn't have the manpower, the human power to look after things, he's gonna take matters into his own hands. And I think a lot of people, certainly conservatives, would say, yeah, that's right. Tell a story about a guy who's fed up with the system breaking and people telling him that he's racist. And by the way, I say this with the new news this week is Yelp is going to add a racism indicator on businesses. Yelp already has some issues with some people who use it, who are business owners, say they're great when people post phony stuff. I know somebody who's a doctor who had somebody post something phony on Yelp, and Yelp took it right off. But there are other people who say Yelp doesn't do that in a timely manner at all, and that they're employees who've actually done some shady stuff when the business owners rejected Yelp's offer or Yelp's request for, do you want to buy some advertising and blah, blah, blah services? And they said no, and bad stuff happened. So there's two sides of the spectrum of stories being reported for Yelp. But this new racism indicator is super disturbing. It sounds nonsensical because you're telling me random people can post stories about it when we live in an era that you just said where people are saying the ultimate moral truth is more important than the factual truth. And I want to come back to that in a second because somebody said that about 20 years ago that scared me, and now we're living in the reality of it. But anyway, so the issue is, how are we dealing with all this stuff? And if I was hard right, I'd say, yeah, I want to tell a story about a business guy who's going to take matters into his own hand and kick butt and show people who are wronging him. But the thing is, the way I'm writing the story, it's starting out that you may be convinced that's what's going to happen, and it doesn't happen that way. When this guy gets to what he thinks he wants, things don't go the way he was thinking that they were. Because that's the Christian part. The godly part of the storytelling is, I can explain the rage, but I can't give you what you think you want because that's not what God is going to teach you. He's not going to teach you the evil, rage-filled, get justice at my own hands. What I want to say is, this is kind of a little bit of a backtrack really quickly, but the whole thing about why it's even hard for us to even have this stance, to be balanced and try to be fair and look at things from a godly standpoint, is because we live in an era right now where the ends justify the means. So lies and deceit, and it can be both sides. It can be right and left. Lies and deceit are okay so long as the ends justify the means, the moral ends. And 20 years ago, 18 years ago, something like that, Michael Moore, documentary filmmaker who did Roger and Me and a bunch of stuff. He's a really good documentary filmmaker, but he made Bowling for Columbine. And after that movie came out, a bunch of people did exposés saying there are all kinds of things in the movie that he manipulated that were not true. And there's even a documentary about it called Michael Moore Hates America that I really like, where the guys tracked him down because he wouldn't do an interview. And they went to a showing of one of his movies and literally were able to get up to the mic at the film festival and say, we're making a movie called, Michael Moore Hates America. And he goes, ooh, that sounds like a movie I wouldn't want to see. And they go, well, and they ask him a question, and he didn't really give them much of a response. But what he had said in print in interviews was, I don't care if everything I show is factual. Basically, if it's completely pure fact, I'm concerned with the ends. What I believe the ends are true. I don't, how I get there, I'm going to do what I have to get to the ends. And I thought at the time, I was so shocked by that. Wow, you're a filmmaker who's supposedly making news documentaries and you're willing to distort the truth. And then it turns out, yeah. And now we live in an era where everybody's doing it. That was a shock 15 years ago, 18 years ago when that movie won the Oscar. And now this is normal. So our natural inclination as believers is to say, I'm fed up with this insanity. I am just going to show the truth from my point of view, emotion and passion and all, and fist waving and all. But when I step back from my rage and I pray, I know that the Lord says, if you're going to do art for my sake, you do not get to do that, because that's not honest either. Your standard is much higher than the standards of others who don't believe in me. And that's where it's like, oh man, okay. Because if I wanted to be a success, I might be able to start telling stories about rage culture, and I might get a whole bunch of people who are like, that's comfort food. That's what a lot of news media is. Certain channels, you watch this because it's comfort food on the left, or you watch this, it's comfort food on the right. But that's not what God wants for us. And as artists struggling, we have to resist the temptation to actually even tell a story that might actually make us more money as struggling artists, because that's not what God wants. So anyway.
You mentioned I read somewhere yesterday or the day before that I think this was the right stat. I think it was the right numbers, but we are 7 times more likely to read a fake news story than a truthful news story. So digest that.
Wow.
We want a lie 7 times more than we want the truth, because it feeds our echo chambers. You mentioned the Yelp thing. I don't want to get into that, but here's what scared me about that. From what I read, Yelp's policy is they post that racist business flag before they investigate it.
Right. Yep.
So you're going to lose your business before anyone even finds out if that is true or not. That's scary, but it goes back to this idea of Michael Moore. Our ends will justify the means. And if that means I have to lie, kill, look at the last several months. How many we will brush off a murder if it doesn't support our political narrative, and we will not even care. Because the ends justify the means, like you said. You're so right. God is a God of truth and just laws and truth. And oh my gosh, yeah, I mean it's stunning. Now I do feel that. I mean, I have my own political opinions. I'm going to vote for who I'm going to vote for. I have every right to vote for that person. I have every right not to tell anybody if I don't want to.
Yeah.
Because I believe that God does establish authorities on earth in a matter of kind of common grace. That's grace given to the world. Not what we would call saving grace, where a person knows Christ and is forgiven of their sins, but common grace. So we don't just live in perpetual matrix-like evil and dysfunction. And part of that is God establishing governing authorities. So we vote for policies that we believe will be beneficial and just for everyone. At the same time, we also realize that we live in a broken world, and no political party is going to solve every one of these problems. And I think that's what a lot of is going on right now, is that politics has replaced religion, has replaced faith. Someone said, like, everyone worships something. Like, we were made to worship. So if you're not worshiping, like, say, a God, well, then you're going to worship politics. But within that comes this idea that my political views have to be perfect, and that every single aspect of the side I'm on is right and can't be wrong. And so because ends justify the means, and my side is always right, you give yourself the freedom to hate that other person. I mean, there's a dude from my old church that I don't get on social media at all anymore, but a friend sent me a screen post. And this guy posted last weekend something like, I won't pray for Trump. I pray that he dies. So let's just unpack that for a second. And we're going way off the idea of art right now. I get it.
Yeah,
but
we're going to bring it back.
But we're going to unpack this because regardless of one's political views or opinions on the president, you refuse to pray for someone, which is a direct violation of Bible, what the Bible says, to pray for your leaders. And you're hating your brother when Jesus said, love your enemy and pray for your enemy and love your brother. This dude from my old church is in sin. But because he's allowed his political fervor to replace his spiritual fervor in Christ, he has allowed himself to be in sin. Then my friend actually wrote him a message kind of calling him out on it, and he deflected it and just defended himself. And it's like, no, dude, you can't defend that. You are in sin. You are wrong. Your post was evil. That's sick, man. That's disgusting. And I have that part of me that wants to go there too, wants to pick my side, not realizing the only side that I can be on that is perfect is Christ. That's the only hill that I know, one, wins in the end, and is worthy of that level of allegiance to me. If you think Biden or Trump are completely worthy of your complete allegiance, keep popping your Prozac, because you're going to be let down time and time again.
Yeah. Exactly. So what do we do? We've been talking this whole time as artists. How do we live in this world and work as Christian artists?
Well,
and the key is, go ahead and say what
I'm so sorry for interrupting you. I wanted to say that because you and I have struggled with this because we have written in the past not wanting to cause waves and piss people off. And a lot of that is because we would love to be able to sell a book, and I think both of us have gotten to a point in our lives where we're like, no, we can't be too silent anymore. We have to be bold. So I do think it's to be compassionate and empathy with your characters, but at the same time, it should be a little unsettling probably. It should make people put a pebble in someone's shoe and say, man, cancel culture. Man, I'm into cancel culture. Is that really right? Put a pebble in someone's shoe, as this guy, one of my favorite apologists, Greg Kokel, says. So that's it right there. For me, it's be honest, charitable, and kind, but also put a pebble in someone's shoes. Make them a little uncomfortable. Not let them just exist in their echo chamber forever, even when they read my stuff.
Yeah, and I'm going to go meta here because you just said something that I think the last bit of this conversation before we wrap is Okay, so what we're doing as artists, we're doing this podcast and we're talking about our lives and our art. But what we're also doing tonight is we're talking about our opinions on CRT and cancel culture. We're outing ourselves, which means independent of our writing our stories, we're putting our arses on the line a bit by saying these are some of our opinions which themselves would be held up to be canceled. Canceled. Now, you and I are both married to women who are not white. We have half of our in-laws, all of our in-laws are those sides of our family are not white, but we're white guys. So when people see us and we're talking about these things, we're white dudes, which we could easily get heaped into. You're conservatives and you're on the far right, and this could have an impact on all kinds of things, potential with writing, who knows what. But we, as artists, we are struggling with these things and want to be godly in what we're doing. And we don't fall on sides that are political. Like you said, politics is the new religion. We're not falling on sides. And that's what the point of the takeaway of this is. There are legitimate arguments in the calls for about injustice, the discussions, the debates. There's the African American, the Black experience in this country. There's tons of bad that goes back a long time, and we need to change. We need changes. We need changes starting in education. I was talking with a pastor recently, like a month ago, and we were talking about some of the solutions to these issues are we need to do a better job in our educational system to provide opportunities for people who don't have as many. In other words, one of the main things that is pretty well settled law in this country is schools don't have to have the same money. If you live in a rich town and taxes are higher, and then you live in another state or on the border of the state in a poor town, your school doesn't your school doesn't necessarily get the same funding. And when I was in law school, I did some outreach work with schools, going out and making sure kids were getting their IEPs, kids who needed extra education, which is almost everybody. Most kids actually could qualify, but not every school, even within Los Angeles, had the same resources. Some were amazing, some were much poorer. Some outside of LA County were amazing, and other places were not. And part of the biggest problem that we have in all these issues are when we start with our youth and kids don't have the same opportunities, it opens up all kinds of problems. And this is one big thing. And what I'm saying as a believer is we are talking about these issues, Marxism, progressive church, CRT, but the thing is, it's not that I'm dismissing the importance, or you are, that people have struggled and they actually need justice. There are terrible bad cops out there who are super evil who need to be removed forever from law enforcement. But that isn't law enforcement at large. That's not everybody. And we as believers have to, and not falling in the right or the left, we actually have to say, what is the real problem? As you said in the beginning, Michael, about we have to discern, we have to look at the issue and not the people. We can't say, because there are issues in law enforcement in various places in this country, all law enforcement are evil or bad. There are problems, and therefore we need to find what those problems are and work on them. We don't throw away the whole system, just like we don't throw the whole person away in the garbage can and cancel them because they said something controversial or because they have an opinion that's different from us. So what we're trying to do as artists and in our walk is we're trying to live in a place of truth where we examine these issues and say, what's true? I don't follow the hard right line and listen to people on the right that tell me this is how it is and we're all pro-police. I'm like, yeah, I'm pro-police and law enforcement, but I'm not going to turn a blind eye to wrong. And at the other side, the left has their arguments. I'm like, you're right, social justice. A lot of African Americans have been treated like garbage and haven't had rights and haven't had opportunities that I have. But it doesn't mean that I say every person who's a certain color has the same experience, and there's no way you can say every person who has a certain lighter tone skin has had an easy life or has had privilege because of their skin tone. Go tell that to the poorest people who live in West Virginia in the mountain country who are so poor they barely have running water. Go tell those folks that their privilege of being white really helped them out a lot. So the gist of this is we're putting ourselves out there to talk about this as artists because we're talking about our struggle in this time. And it does put us in a bit of an awkward spot because there may be people who would someday want to read or listen to our stuff and they might see this podcast and go, we're going to cancel Chris and Michael. We have to take that risk because we're believers and we're debating this and we're trying to navigate this world with the Lord. And we're trying to say, what do you want us to do, Father? How do we listen to you? And we're just trying to share that on this walk. We're trying to share our struggles with all these issues and say, we're struggling with it too. We're trying to find our place. So, but I refuse for anybody to tell me I have to be right or left. I refuse it. As a Christian, I refuse for somebody to tell me that I have to be hard right or have a certain conservative view. I do on issues like abortion and other hot topics. I do have hard right, but my application of my solution for that isn't necessarily what the hard right says, or even the middle right. It depends. So anyway, that's kind of, I think, what we're hitting on here is we're actually outing ourselves because we're outing the struggle as struggling artists who could sink our careers by just telling people what we really think.
Yeah, and I mean, I have to think, as polarized as we are right now, that everyone is already settled into a camp. But if there's anyone out there that is not already settled into a camp and is actually taking a look around at the camps, there's a verse in the Bible that Jesus says was, you will know them by their fruit. This idea of a bad tree produces bad fruit and a good tree produces good fruit. And, when if I can be the critical race theory stuff, it is a worldview. I mean, don't let anyone fool you. It is a worldview. It is a system that is trying to explain all your beliefs and experiences and how you interpret the world. The Christian faith is a worldview. It's how we interpret the world, what's wrong with the world, the future, and a great hope to come. Trying to marry these two worldviews is not going to happen. They are incompatible with each other because you will know them by your fruit. If you look around, at the fruit of critical race theory and Antifa, what you're talking about: violence, murder, lawlessness, hatred, racism. Racism on all fronts, by the way, from all races. Hatred, discord, mistrust, grievance. I'm looking at a Christian worldview saying love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. That is the fruit of this worldview. So the hill that I die on is that worldview right there. Because if we read a story, it reminds me ages ago when I was blogging, and I've told this on this podcast, I believe, and I was bitter. I was single still. I was still broke, and I wrote a blog and sent it to a buddy, and he was like, "You sound bitter." And I realized then, I can't do that. I can't let my bitterness into this. So if I read a story that's just spewing off the gracelessness of, the critical, the culture, mm-hmm. which I believe to be depraved, I'm in the short term, it fuels my anger and my bitterness or whatever. But I'm gonna forget it, because it's not lasting. The fruit is rotten and it disintegrates. But if I read a story that is honest as far as depicting the struggles of the world and the racism and the sex traffic, let's talk the evils. But there is in it a spirit of grace, forgiveness, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, self-control, mm-hmm. then that's a story that's going to stick with me and may actually change me and may actually cause me to re-examine a view that I have. Because I have logs in my eye that I don't see. I have blind spots, and I need people to point those out. And if I'm reading a story that subtly does that and causes me to think, man, I could be wrong about that, versus a story that's just cursing at me and telling me what a piece of garbage I am. Yeah, well, up yours. Anyway, so I guess that's what I want to leave right there. It's test your art to see what the worldview is going on through the writer and the artist, and then what worldview is actually grace-filled and forgiveness-centered. Because that's probably the one you want to stick to right there.
Yeah. And I want to say that there are people who are on the other end of the spectrum who actually are grappling with these things too. And while you were talking really quickly, I want to look something up because I started reading this book called Friday Black. It came out a couple years ago. It's a short story collection. It's actually not very long. And the artist's name, the writer is Nana Kwame. And then I don't know how to pronounce his name, and I apologize. It's like Adjei-Brenyah. So it's Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. But anyway, I started reading it, and he has a story in there called The Finkelstein Five, and it's set in the near future. And unfortunately, what happens in that Finkelstein Five story is happening now. It's people who are African American are fed up, black folks who are fed up, and they start randomly attacking white people because another big case, like something, not Breonna Taylor, but something even more serious and obviously wrong happened. And in the end, the lead character, is ready to kill a bunch of white kids, two white teenager or college kids who are necking at a park, because they go to this park at night knowing it's a place where kids come in their cars to hang out, and they know they're white kids, so they're college kids. And this guy, his buddy, and two other people are there, and they're going to kill these kids. And the beautiful thing about the story is they're going through the process, and you see and feel the lead character and how hard it's been for him in life and how unfair it's been, and that he's kind of sold, he's bought into it for a minute that he's going to do this, and he goes. And of course, what's awesome is in the moment when they pull these kids out and they're ready to kill them, he turns the tables and he beats up his friends to stop them from killing the kids. And he's got it right. This guy got the story out there about feeling the rage and expressing it, but his character did what was right. Whether he was raised a Christian or not, or a Muslim, I don't know, but he got the godly point of view in there in the end of that story. And it's good, and I highly recommend it. I'll put a link to the book at the down below this podcast and vidcast. But yeah, it's, and I got to be careful because that book has some very hard R-rated stuff in there, so I don't recommend it for everybody. But yeah, we're talking at the end, we are counted by the Lord for what we're doing. We're not counted by the world. We're not counted by a political party. We have to face the Lord. And I'm trying to write, and I'm trying to say everything that I do in this very podcast with that in mind, that I owe him at the end of the day. I have to account for everything. And in my work and in what I say and do, that's it. And I thank you, Michael. I think you've had some great insights and your research. And also, if you want to put a link, you mentioned about the you mentioned about the fruit of your actions will show. The fruit shows whether you're good or bad. And there's an article I know you were passing around that was going around today in a group of guys that we know. And if that's something that can be quoted or whatever, there's a good little excerpt there we were reading about that very thing, about looking at fruit and some of the modern movement in the world that says we're good, but you look at the fruit of it and it's like, oh no, the fruit's not good. We could put a link to that because that was a great little article that we're looking at too. So I think I've said as much as I can.
Well said, buddy. I thank you, and I thank everyone for listening. With this, in the end, yeah, it's like you're right. God will hold these things to account, and writing truthfully, but also being bold to say some things that our instinct would be to not say because we don't want to offend, but sometimes we've got to. So may we do that and continue to do that.
Yeah.
But I've loved our talk. I appreciate your honesty, and I want to thank again you all for listening. We hope to continue to do this and hope you continue to tune in. Until then, have a wonderful rest of the week, and we will see you next time on King of the Middle.
All right. Good night, everybody. Bye-bye.